This is the launch of a new series that the Baha'i Chair is engaging in called Solidarity Across Differences. This second fall symposium featured by the Baha'i Chair for World Peace is being co-sponsored with the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, both of them at the University of Maryland. Today's lecture is quite important in relation to what the Baha'i Chair for World Peace has begun as a series of conversations on campus to better understand how, as human beings, we can learn to remove some of our differences and appreciate our diversity. The Baha'i Chair is primarily interested in learning from scholars who do very good research in these various areas that help us to understand this complex topic. How can we overcome the divides that separate us along the lines of identity, class, gender, religion, race, and nationality? More crucially, today's symposium, featuring our two eminent speakers, draws on sound scholarship, and I would like to say very creative scholarship, that allows us to explore how better to bring about true understanding and solidarity across our differences. This topic is extremely important, as I mentioned, and we hope that we, beyond today's lectures and presentations, that we continue a dialogue in our classes, on campus, no matter where we are, to see how we can bridge these differences. I would like to welcome our two speakers, Dr. Cohen and Dr. Ray. They are, as you all probably know, they're very active on this campus doing wonderful work. And it is with great pleasure that I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Rashawn Ray, who is Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of Maryland. He received his PhD in Sociology from Indiana University in 2010. From 2010 to 2012, he was a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health Policy Research Scholar at the University of California, at Berkeley, and at San Francisco. Dr. Ray's research addresses the mechanisms that manufacture and maintain racial and social inequality. His work also speaks to ways that inequality may be attenuated through racial uplift activism and social policy. Currently, he's working on a series of projects centered on the intersections of race, class, and gender. The first project examines racial differences in barriers and incentives to physical activity among the middle class. The second project investigates how perceived body size shapes race and class differences in the mental, physical, and sexual health of girls and young women. With Dr. Chris Marsh, also of the Sociology Department, another project explores how the stigma of aging singles influences psychological distress and physical activity among middle-class Black women. Finally, with Dr. Dana Fisher, also of the Sociology Department, Dr. Ray is exploring the impact of school gardens, the impact that school gardens have on academic achievement, nutritional knowledge, and civic engagement among children in 90 elementary schools in Washington, D.C. Dr. Ray is the editor of Race and Ethnic Relations in the 21st Century, History, Theory, Institutions, and Policy. He is very well published in numerous journals, and he has been awarded funding from the National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health, American Sociological Association Minority Fellowship Program, Society for the Study of Social Problems, and the Ford Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rashawn Ray.
Okay, so I appreciate everyone coming out this afternoon. I know that it's such a wonderful November day. I'm so happy that the weather is still nice outside, and hopefully it'll stay that way for quite a while. The title of my talk today is Being Color Brave Rather Than Color Blind, Forming a Racially Inclusive Sociological Imagination. Now, I actually can't take credit for the first part of this title, the Color Brave title. In fact, that comes from finance executive Melody Hobson, who has a very intriguing TEDx talk. And Melody Hobson just happens to be married to George Lucas. So if you're a fan of movies, then you would know her husband. But what I'm going to try and do with this particular talk is to not just talk about how we need to be color brave, but to actually discuss what that looks like. So I really appreciate Dr. Hoda Mahmoudi for inviting me to talk today. The work that you're doing on campus is simply transformative. It's very important around diversity issues, around issues about ameliorating structural inequality, and as well as building solidarity. And hopefully we can talk about that and start that conversation today. I also want to thank people from the Department of Sociology, as well as students and faculty affiliated with the Critical Race Initiative. A lot of what I'll talk about today will be kind of laying out kind of the theoretical premise behind some of the work that we're trying to do in the Department of Sociology. So I'll get right into it. First, let me start off with just a broad question. Is the glass half empty or half full on race relations? Just really kind of think about that. I mean, on one hand, we might think we have a biracial, black identifying president. You have a person like me who is black who can stand up here at a university and talk about race. This is definitely much different from, say, 50 years ago. But on the other hand, there are also some challenges that we still face in the United States and beyond as it relates to racial inequality, and potentially more broadly as it relates to social inequality around gender and social class. So what I want to quickly do, obviously a holiday just passed, and if anyone knows my family, you'll know that every single holiday is just a really big deal in my house. So as we were searching for Halloween costumes, I came across some that I felt were quite troubling, and I just want to show a few of them to you. This was from a few years ago from a U.S. Department of Homeland Security Halloween party. This is who they decided to give the award of best costume to. This is actually a white man who has browned his skin. He has on dreadlocks, and he is donning a prison outfit, right? Next we have a couple who decides to more or less glamorize the Ray Rice incident and him knocking his now wife out cold in the elevator. And what's interesting about this is this was on Facebook, and the son actually is the one who posted the picture. So I just kind of think about the ways in which, in this regard, the wife as well as the son is complicit in domestic violence, as well as the fact that they browned their skin as well. But of course, not kind of the classic blackface that we might see like this, which was from last Halloween, where we have an individual on the right side who's supposed to be George Zimmerman, on the left supposed to be Trayvon Martin, and in the classic blackface, and has on the infamous hoodie now in terms of what's going on around how people think about this. And this one was quite shocking to me. This is a student, some of you might not necessarily seen this one. This was a student, and hopefully you can see it, I'm unsure. But let me kind of make out what you're seeing. This is a student at Auburn University who has a noose around his neck. He's black and kind of doing some research. He's Canadian. He's going to a school in the South, and he is pledging a predominantly white fraternity. And this was part of his pledge process, right? They kind of challenged him to do this. So he goes to this local bar, and he lets people hold this noose and kind of hold it up as if he is being lynched. All right, now, for me, most people are probably saying, what the heck made him do that? Well, I do some work on hazing as well, and I'll tell you that people are definitely at times coerced to do different things. But at Auburn, they kind of have a history of this. This is when I was an undergrad, and I remember a big case around what was happening with a fraternity at Auburn, and I'm just highlighting Auburn to kind of show that the incidents we see today have been repeated throughout history. Right? And so this is actually, all these individuals are white. The person in the white is kind of donning the classic black face from the early part of the 20th century, where blacks weren't allowed to be in films. And so you kind of see that again. We see the noose kind of hanging around the person's neck here. So you kind of see this same pattern. All right, and then we see this. This was in my great state of Tennessee, right? And so This was a white family who decided to put this outside as a Halloween kind of exhibit. And if you look closely, the little kid actually has a knife in his back, right? And then the rest of the family is kind of hanging on trees. And they didn't realize or understand why people had a problem with this, all right? Now, what this may show you is, on one hand, you might say, well, this is people just having fun. And on one hand, it's harmless fun. It doesn't mean anything. But we know, based on the racial attitudes literature, that people who kind of support these type of acts or who are dismissive and don't necessarily want to acknowledge that these type of acts exist might also be more likely to kind of support a program like Stop and Frisk. And also, let me show this. This was from Ferguson this past weekend. And of course, today the grand jury is supposed to decide whether or not the police officer who killed Michael Brown is going to be tried in any sort of way. But this was from a rally. So things are still happening in Ferguson, even though the news might not necessarily show it. But the point of this is to show similarities across time as it relates to the ways in which black bodies are treated. So in 1814, we have slavery with the shackles. 1914, we have Jim Crow and the lynching era. In 2014, we have mass incarceration. So we see the ways in which over time, if we kind of juxtapose these different images, we can see the ways in which things are similar over time. So let me ask you, in theory, Stop and Frisk might be a good program, right? In theory, the point is that you see someone who looks suspicious, and you can supposedly objectively say whether or not they should be stopped and frisked and potentially arrested. So let me ask just a broad question, just a quick show of hands, so you all gonna have to participate with me quickly. If this had a 50% success rate, so every 1 out of 2 people who were stopped actually had something on them or were committing a crime, would you be okay with that? 1 out of 2. Basketball season just started. It's okay. I think 50% is fine. Like that's a really good field goal percentage. You're an all-star shooting like 50%. Raise your hand again. Yeah, okay. All right, so 50%. What about a third? If you were like, I would even be okay if it was 1 out of 3. That's like baseball. Yeah, it's like, you hit 333. You're an all-star in baseball. Raise your hand. Anybody? Okay, raise your hand if you think it would have to be over 50%, 75%. Okay, all right, so we got a nice mixture. Well, what if I told you that it only resulted in 2% of individuals who were stopped actually having something? 2%. I don't know any federal or state policy that should be funded having a 2% success rate. Right? So the question becomes, why does this still persist? Well, if we also look at these differences, this is in New York State. This was in 2011. Of the nearly 700,000 stops, 51% were black, despite the fact that blacks only represent 13% of the New York City population. A third were Latino, despite the fact that Latinos only represent 16%, and 9% were white. 56% of stops involved a frisk, and a high percentage of those actually involved physical force. Okay? Now, what are the implications of this? Well, one implication is a study that just came out showing that black teenagers are 21 times more likely than white teenagers to be killed by a police officer. These are huge disparities we're talking about. So on one hand, we're talking about a group, 2% of them have been stopped where they have something on them. That means 98% of the people who are stopped weren't doing anything wrong. But yet and still, we see this huge disparity in who is actually killed by a police officer. Nonetheless, roughed up, bullied, intimidated, or physically injured. And when we think about stand your ground, one big thing that came out from the George Zimmerman trial was people were saying, well, if the roles were reversed, so if it was a black person who killed a white person or a person who potentially phenotypically looked white, like George Zimmerman, who would be identified as being white Hispanic, we would see the same outcome. And the data simply don't support that. This is from 2000 through 2011, kind of the time in which these laws started coming about, stand your ground laws. This is if you say stand your ground and you kill a black person. This is the likelihood of being found not guilty compared to killing a black person and living in a non-stand your ground state. And this is the kind of likelihood if you kill a white person, either claiming stand your ground or not claiming stand your ground. So it becomes a big difference in terms of who you kill and whether or not you can justify that particular killing, holding all else constant. And the implications of this becomes a huge difference in the age-adjusted death rate. So this is out of 100,000 people. This is the likelihood of a person dying throughout the life course, kind of before, just getting old, if you will. And we kind of see a huge difference by race. Now, what's interesting here is that, does anyone know what the number one kind of violent death is that people face? Anybody want to take a guess? Yeah, suicide. Yeah, suicide's number one. Homicide's two, but right behind homicide is actually what we call death by legal intervention. It's an authority figure like a police officer killing someone. About 25% of all violent deaths kind of result in death by legal intervention, right? And so a majority of black men, even though we could talk about black on black crime, but a majority of individuals who are killed are actually killed not by necessarily another person all the time, but by death by legal intervention. So oftentimes there are things we hear in the media, and then there are things we don't hear in the media about how pervasive this actually is. What about when people go to trial for a crime? This was out of 700 felony cases. This is what happens when there are no black people in the jury pool. If you know, anybody ever been to court to watch a case? Yeah, you see the ways in which, anybody ever been called to go to jury duty? Oftentimes people dread it, right? And you go, and it's a fascinating, raise your hand if you've never been called to jury duty. Okay, well, you all will get called at some point in time, right? Now that you all have turned 18 and you're getting grown, and you should go and you should see that experience, because what you'll see is that it's actually a real process. It's really methodical in terms of how lawyers decide who to include and who to exclude, right? And so what happens is, if there are no blacks in the jury pool, we see a huge disparity in conviction rates. But when there's at least one black person on the jury pool, that doesn't even mean that they were included to be on the jury. We see that the percentage of conviction is basically the same. This 2% is a negligible, non-significant difference. So we see a huge difference there. And so what happens when they get out of prison? Well, you want to go get a job, right? And so sociologist Diva Pager looked at this. She sent out two different groups of people, one group that had a criminal record, one group that did not. The other difference was that some were black, some were white. What she found was that not only did whites without a criminal record get called back and hired more than blacks, but whites with a criminal record was more likely to get called back and hired than blacks without a criminal record. That's the ways in which race operates in the United States, right? And then, of course, we can think about gender and the gender gap in regards to what happens. And this is really where we start to see the intersections of race, class, and gender at play. You kind of see the differences in, for every dollar that a white man makes, how much money Latino, black, or white women make. So we still see a huge gender disparity, despite the fact that women are outnumbering men in obtaining bachelor's degrees. We still see this disparity. And it really doesn't have much to do with people asking for more money. Instead, it's about the starting point of where people actually have. And so individuals face a glass ceiling as it relates to inequality. And when it relates to the intersections of race, class, and gender, Dr. Kumail Shorter-Gooden co-authored a book, and Dr. Kumail Shorter-Gooden is the Chief Diversity Officer and one of the Vice Presidents here at UMD, called Shifting. And it talked about the ways in which black women have to negotiate their identities in the labor market, right? In terms of having to compromise or try to assimilate. And the reason why they try to do that is some of my own research on physical activity has showed is that they face penalties in the labor market for presenting themselves a particular way. Their hair, their makeup, just their being, right, disrupts a particular space. And I think one great example of this is Rhonda Lee, who was a weather reporter in Louisiana. And Rhonda Lee, someone wrote in and said, you know, I see this woman on TV, she does the weather really, really well, but I just can't get over how short her hair is. Can she grow some hair? Right? So she responds on Facebook eloquently, didn't use any vulgar language. She came back to work and she was fired. These are the type of experiences that black women have in the labor market, right? And on one hand, it speaks to the reasons why oftentimes individuals, even individuals who are more affluent, who have achieved some level of success, are quiet on these matters because they understand that their place in the labor market is contentious, it's precarious in terms of what's going on. Let's quickly look at a couple other outcomes. Something else you might not know as it relates to education is that as it relates to education, what is something that the United States promises every single child who is born in the United States or who goes to school here? Someone just blurted out. What does the United States say? Yeah, and that they're going to be equal, right? That every kid is going to get an equal education. Well, That's really never been true. But if we just go back to 2003, kind of with the implementation of No Child Left Behind during President Bush, what we see is that there started to be a reliance on property taxes, which is the green line, compared to a reliance on state or federal aid, which is the black line. One thing you know about property taxes, and for people who go to UMD, you probably know this pretty well, because there's a lot of students who come from Montgomery County, who come from Howard County. The more affluent the area and neighborhood you live in, the higher your property taxes, because the property is worth more. It doesn't necessarily mean that the percentage that's coming out of the property is higher. It simply means that the absolute amount of money, when we compare it relatively to another neighborhood, is more. This means that schools in more affluent neighborhoods are going to be better than schools in less affluent neighborhoods. Now, why does this matter? This matters because we see a huge difference in students by race who attend high poverty compared to low poverty schools. We see that for high poverty schools, these are the poor schools. A high percentage of Latino and black students attend these schools compared to low poverty schools. A high percentage of white students attend these schools. So how does this link up with test scores, which of course is what it's all about? Unfortunately, in many ways, and the ways in which students are being trained today, is if we look at 8th grade reading and math, we see that for low poverty schools, these are the affluent schools, 87% are basic, 47% are proficient. That essentially means kind of being above average. And then 15% are advanced, right? That means being way above average in terms of how they do it. So basic is meaning that you're passing, you're progressing quite well. And then we look at the huge differences for high poverty. Right, only about 50% are considered basic. Just knowing basic stuff. Stuff that for you all in this room you take for granted because you were trained well, because you went to good schools. It's the reason why you're in college, right? So as I return to, is the glass half empty or half full? I think maybe the more important question is maybe the glass changes shape over time. Potentially what we see is that the liquid is still the same in the glass, but the overall shape is changing. So the question is how do we kind of break or fracture this glass ceiling that we're seeing? I want to kind of take this from Beverly Tatum, and I have to acknowledge, again, Dr. Kumair Shorter-Gooden for reminding me of this great analogy, even though I appropriate it differently. But if you're in the airport and you are on one of these sliding escalators, I kind of love these things, right? You get on there and what happens? You can go really, really fast, right? And so on one hand, if you are on this side and if you're on the left side, that means if people are standing there, they need to get on the right, right? I mean, that's kind of how it works. It's like when you take the metro, it's like you need to be on the right if you're not trying to move. So if you're on the left, then you can really go fast. You can walk, you can run, right? And if you're on this right side, you're just supposed to stand there. But even if the person on the outside of the escalator is walking, and you're just moving, if you're just standing there on the escalator, you're still moving faster than them, right? And even if people on this left side, compared to, say, a person all the way on this right side, who may decide to take off running, you've seen those frantic people, right, who run in the airport, and you're like, dude, you're just not going to make it. It's okay, right? So you see them sprinting through the airport, and what happens? Luggage is in the way, kids are in the way, people are just standing there kind of looking, trying to figure out where the bathroom is. They're jumping over stuff. They face all these hurdles as they're trying to go through there. And the point is that we can think about inequality in that same way. That if you're on the escalator, born on the escalator, you can just be on the escalator and not even really move. And you're going to still go faster than people who are off of the escalator. But you're going to look at those people and you say, man, they just can't get it together. Look, they just tripped over that person's bag. They're just horrible, right? Instead of potentially realizing that they actually have real hurdles in their way, right? And then we're wondering why people get to the finish line slower when we see these differences. And so how does this kind of broadly relate to inequality? Well, if you're just standing on the escalator and you don't really realize why people are off the escalator, and you think that this will actually lead to change by just letting things go along as they are, what you don't realize is that passivity doesn't lead to progressive change. It reaffirms and maintains social inequality. So in many ways, racism, sexism, classism, it's ingrained in our social institutions. I just gave you 2 examples as it relates to education and the criminal justice system. You don't have to do anything, and that will stay exactly the same. And we will continue to be a country that tries to pride itself on having the best education, despite the fact when you look at the world rankings, we continuously drop. And we don't drop because the education is getting worse. We're dropping because the education in other countries are actually getting better. So we're staying stagnant, right? We also rarely talk about the fact that out of all developing countries, we incarcerate the most people, despite the fact that crime has actually decreased over the past 30 years. Yeah, but of course the media would tell us that something's different. So to create change, we must change, and we have to act. And so what I suggest is that we employ our sociological imagination. This is C. Wright Mills. He was a famous sociologist. He was actually a professor here at UMD in the 1940s. And the way he talked about the sociological imagination, and anyone who's taken an intro sociology class is probably familiar with this, but it's to shift oneself away from the familiar and take on the perspective of the other. So in other words, you have to get off the escalator. Oftentimes, you physically have to turn around. You have to actually try to put yourself in other people's shoes to try to empathize with their particular experience. And kind of the reverse side of the sociological imagination is W.B. Du Bois's veil. W.B. Du Bois was the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard. He was then at Atlanta University, which is now Clark Atlanta Universities, where he headed up the Atlanta University Laboratory, which still to this day is unmatched in terms of the research and the data collected on African Americans across the United States. And what he said it is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of the world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. And I think this image is a great way to try to juxtapose the sociological imagination in the veil. When you're walking down the street, and since it's the image, we'll use a young black man, what do you see? Right? Do you see a teenager with a backpack who's just trying to get to or from school? Do you see a cell phone, or do you potentially see a gun? Jennifer Eberhardt, who came here last year, who just won the MacArthur Award, what her research actually shows is that she showed images of black men and white men holding inanimate objects, and she showed that individuals were more likely to first shoot the black person when they saw them, but also to think that the inanimate object was a gun. Right? And this is the way in which race works unconsciously in terms of what people see. So when say if we go back to when George Zimmerman seen Trayvon Martin that night, if he had have actually looked to see that he was holding a bottle of iced tea and some Skittles, that young boy might still be living. And even if you think about the media, Trayvon Martin was 17. Last time I checked, 17 was still a kid. Right? But yet and still in the media, you'll notice when they talk about teenagers, particularly minority teenagers, they frame them as being adults. That's because research also shows that black youth are perceived as being older than white youth. So when they see them, they physically look bigger, even though they're actually not. Right? That becomes the ways in which blackness operates in terms of the sorts of things we're seeing. So in order to do this, what we have to do is we have to employ critical race theory. Critical race theory recognizes that racism is ingrained in the fabric and system of American society. Now, what's important here is that the individual racists need not exist to note that institutional racism is pervasive in the dominant culture. Now, what does this mean? This means, for the most part, a majority of whites aren't racist, right? What it does mean is that similar to men, individuals benefit from untaken for granted privileges that structure society, right? That oftentimes, because of our privilege, we don't recognize. And then when we don't recognize it, we justify where we are, and we downplay where other people are because they don't have the same privileges that we do. Because then if we acknowledge the privilege that we have, then we have a problem. Because if we acknowledge the privilege we have and we don't do anything about it, what does that say about us? Right? What does that say about us? And so critical race theory identifies that these power structures are based on, similar to the ways in which we think about sexism and male privilege, is based on white privilege and white supremacy, which perpetuates the marginalization of people of color. So to kind of employ this racially inclusive sociological imagination, we have to be color brave rather than color blind. We have to have candid racial conversations without racist intent. This is oftentimes difficult for people. The reason why it's difficult is because we have fewer than 3 meaningful conversations about race with a person who is not of our same racial group in our lifetime. That's what research shows. Less than 3. People simply don't talk about it. We talk about the people who look like us, the same way men sit up and talk about women, right? We don't talk about women the same way when women are present, right? Because that leads to a different kind of conversation. And then that leads to admitting certain forms of privilege that we're not necessarily ready to admit or give up. So we see the ways in which this plays out, right? And we have to take on the view of the other, which I'll talk about the ways in which we do this. What's more important is that we have to focus on race as an experience, a racialized identity, and a social process that shapes institutional conditions. Race isn't simply something that people are born with, right? Race is instead a social construction, right? Studies actually show that individuals across racial groups are over 99% similar, right? And let me tell you, as much as some people want to show that genetic differences by race exist, if they did exist, they would have found them by now, right? Think about that. They just don't really exist, right? And I think some of the classic work or kind of some of the classic studies done on Jesse Owens when he beat Adolf Hitler in Nazi Germany in the Olympics, when they brought his body back, he was still living, right? But literally, this is the ways in which they were using his body, like he was already dead. And they poked and prodded, and they were like, we can't tell any difference between this person's body and someone else's body. Even though people kind of use social Darwinism and pseudoscience to kind of support that. And then finally, we have to shift the discourse past the black-white narrative to highlight processes and mechanisms of racial inequality that affect all racial and ethnic groups. This is particularly important for scholars, right? The black-white dichotomy, which understandably so in the U.S. context, has dominated the research. But now we need to shift as we think about the broader ways in which this happens. And then finally, we need to transform victimization into empowerment. And so to do this, we focus less on what race is and more on what race does, how it's used, how it operates through social interactions and institutional conditions to manufacture and maintain racial inequality. It illuminates the ways that race operates, not only as a point of departure to differentiate individuals, so to separate people who are on the escalator compared to those who are off, but as a destination that everyone is heading towards in their daily lives. This is important because everyone has a racialized experience. On one hand, some individuals' experience allows them to ignore their racialization. On the other hand, some individuals' experience forces them to recognize their racialization and marginalization in most interactions they have in society. It becomes a very key difference, right, in terms of what's going on. So we do this in three main ways. First, we can create change through social interactions, through attitudes and behaviors. And then we can focus on processes and mechanisms. One big one that has been occurring throughout my research is racial composition. The ways in which racial composition affects education outcomes, the ways in which it affects health outcomes, the ways in which it affects how men treat women. And then we can talk about policy to affect institutions. And so to engage in racial uplift activism, and for the most part, you're going to probably be familiar with these. I think they're pretty simple. Is that there are four main things you can do. You can engage in civil rights, is the promotion of the rights of individuals through protests, like they're doing in Ferguson. Strategizing, litigation, and education, public policy, promoting the rights and kind of changing legislative decision-making. One big one could be the ways in which we change how jurors are selected for trials. That would be a big policy change. Engaging in community service is always great. And then raising or giving money for a particular cause. Now, we can combat racial prejudice by gaining knowledge, which is what you all are doing here today. And for most of you, that's what you do in college. And for those of us as professors who are privileged to continue learning every single day, that's what we do for a living. And then you can raise awareness, not just for yourself, but for others. This leads to active forms of resistance. Resistance that can be small, that you don't really realize is big. Like when your friend says something sexist about a woman, right? Or says something racist about someone who's Asian. This allows you to say, hey, that's not cool. You know, I really don't want to hear you say that around me, right? You really shouldn't do that. I know it's difficult to do, but you're basically the only one having these type of conversations with your friends. So you can develop a diversity achievement ideology. You can become more self-aware, right? Then you can become more socially aware, how others view you. That's very important. Oftentimes, we only look at how we view other people or how we think we view ourselves. But when we become socially aware, it means flipping that lens and trying to see, how do people see us? How do people see our privilege or inequality? And then globally aware. What happens to people who are not just in your social surrounding, but outside of your particular context? This leads to agency. Then you can develop a holistic life perspective. Come in touch with who you are spiritually, mentally, emotionally, and physically. And then you can build bridges. This is kind of when you're ready to roll, right? When you're basically ready to go. And I want to share 3 quick examples, maybe 4, of some of the ways in which I've been able to do this. When I was in undergrad, I started up a nonprofit called the Real Life Knowledge Academy. Truth be told, I was actually going on this community service excursion because my girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, was heading it up, and I kind of wanted to be close to her. So I go to this shelter, And what I saw is that it was a shelter for single parents, single mothers rather, and their children. And what I saw is a majority of little boys running around without any male role models. And that kind of fit my experience. I come from a single parent household. I've never seen my biological father before. Something clicked in me that we were connected. So I started up this Real Life Knowledge Academy, and I would pick them up every Saturday. You know, we would do what I called edutainment. We would do something educational, go to a library, read a book, get on the computer, and then do something entertaining. Go to a movie, go to a ball game. One of the guys I always crack up because he just wanted to go to Captain D's. That was his favorite restaurant. So we would just go to Captain D's and eat. And so that was one example. And now these individuals are grown, and many of them have went to college, and so it's nice to have played a role in their lives. I started up a course at Indiana University when I was in grad school for minority, first-generation, and low-income students. And if you know anything about Indiana, these weren't only black kids from urban areas, but these were white kids from southern rural areas who were in my class, who had low GPAs. And I helped them increase their GPAs from an average of 2.3 to 2.8, all of whom except for one. And it wasn't my fault on that one. All of them have since graduated. It just wasn't. And but all the rest of them have since graduated. Many of whom are now in graduate school. One owns his own shoe company, so they're doing very well. When I was at Indiana, I also worked at the Office of Women's Affairs for Dean Yvette Alex Asenso, who is now the Vice President for Diversity at the University of Oregon. I trained and supervised a group of undergraduates who were hand-selected by her to go out and do workshops on the prevention of sexual assault, rape, and violence against women. One big thing we did is we started up a community group called Man Up that consisted of men and women in the community who came together. One big thing we would do is every year during Sexual Assault Awareness Month, which was in the fall, but now it's in the spring, is we would go and talk to all of the football teams in the local area, have them wear white ribbons on their helmets. And it was quite powerful to talk to 80 or 100 high school boys about the importance of thinking about domestic violence and sexual assault. So, in closing, my last question to you is, how do you plan to address race-related problems in the 21st century? Thank you for your time.